اوكي بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. Dear Professor Dr. Omar Qureshi, all our professors, doctors, our postgraduate student, all the participants here in Ibn Khaldun conference room and also in the Zoom and the YouTube channel. I welcome you to our distinguished lecture today to be presented by our Professor Omar on a very important topic. The title which you saw on the poster, Sunni Metaphysics and the Ontological Status of Universals. As you see, the title of this lecture is very relevant to Islamic thought and civilization, very relevant to our Ummah today. And we are really glad to have Professor Omar here. And I would like to thank all our professors, Prof. Osman Bakar, Prof. Khaliq, and all the professors who are here with us today. Without any further delay, I pass the mic to our moderator, Associate Professor Dr. Nasreen. Please go ahead, Dr. Nasreen.
Yes, thank you very much, the Dean, Professor Abdul Aziz Wahood. We are very, very delighted today, actually, for, and honored that we have in our presence Professor Omar Qureshi, who has come from a very, very far land from us in America. And he's here to speak to us about the topic as mentioned just now by our Dean, Sunni Metaphysics and the Ontological Status of Universals. Before we start, just a brief overview of our speaker. He is the provost of ZAYTUNA College in America. I think it's at Berkeley in America since 2017. And he has earned his PhD in Cultural and Educational Policy in 2016 from Loyola University of Chicago in the state of Illinois, USA. His thesis was Badruddin Ibn Jama'ah and the Highest Good of Islamic Education. And it is interesting that our speaker today comes from a scientific background. He did his first degree in microbiology from University of Chicago as well. And he had been teaching biology in, I think, in many places in the world, in Saudi Arabia and as well as in America. And then coming back, he developed more into his interest in Islamic studies, in Islamic thought. And now after his PhD, we find him teaching at ZAYTUNA, Metaphysical Foundations, Contemporary Muslim Thought, Principles of Islamic Jurisprudence, and also Al-Ghazali. And he has presented at many conferences, mainly in the USA. And he has taught at various academic settings, including, as mentioned just now, in Manarat Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, Universal School, Morgan Park Academy, and he has developed curriculum and taught courses in Islamic Teacher Education Program, etc. So if I want to read his CV, it's going to take a long time. Let's just, focus on what he's going to present to us. And he's gracious enough to write a paper for this presentation, and is on the screen, as we will see. Those of you in Zoom, you'll be able to see this clearly. Those of you here, hopefully you'll be able to follow the arguments as we go along on this much important topic of the ontological status of universals. And we will see why it is important as the lecture progresses. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor now to Professor Omar Qureshi. Please, Bismillah.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. I want to, it's an honor for me to be in front of Dr. Osman Bakar, the Dean, as well, Professor Aziz, and all of you illustrious and very intimidating students and professors here to speak in front of. So I come to you as a student and tell me where I'm wrong and tell me where I'm right. So that's the whole spirit of this, is to share some small little things I've learned in my path, and to see and to learn from all of you and the discussion, inshallah. We're here, just some brief comments on the topic for today, is we are talking about this idea of universals, and this is something that has that we come through as a topic, as an idea that's seen first and foremost in metaphysics and logic, when we study theology, and even in grammar, the idea of ism, jins, and things like this. So one sees this idea here of what we call universals in very different sciences throughout our own Islamic tradition, intellectual tradition, but also even in contemporary sciences today. The idea of, for example, a species in biology. I'm speaking to my own thing here, but it's a very similar problem to that of universals. So, for example, in evolutionary biology, one of the main challenges that philosophers of biology have is, how do you define a species, right? And this is a fundamental and very important question, which many of them do not have an answer to, although evolution is supposed to be on the origin of species, yet what they're trying to describe and provide a basis for and to explain is very much in contention, this notion of a species. And so the notion of essences, right, is also embedded in this concept of a species. And even in, as we'll see, in the theory of evolution and contemporary discussions on it, the idea of, do you have a realist conception of a species or you have a nominalist conception of a species, is very much debated and discussed today. And these are problems that are unresolved at this point in time. So all of these do go back to what we will call this idea of a universal, and what is their ontological status as well. So as what I'll do today in this essay, it's just something that the idea of the essay is to say, okay, how is it that Sunni, I'm focusing pretty much on Sunni theologians and their treatment of universals. I'm not focusing on the Mu'tazilis or the Shia or any other particular theological or philosophical school. So it's very focused. And the reason why I'm focusing on Sunnis in particular, because many contemporary writers, and from different backgrounds, either academic or religious backgrounds, they have an understanding of Sunni theologians and their position on universals. And that as I studied universals and studied logic and philosophy and theology, I realized what they were saying wasn't entirely, it didn't fit what I was encountering, in other words. And one of the main claims is that the Ash'ari school of theology, the Maturidiyya, and also the Athari, in particular Ibn Taymiyyah, had what's called a nominalist position regarding universals. And so you have writers such as Wal Hallaq, who in his translation of Imam Suyuti's Mukhtasar of Ar-Radd ala al-Mantiqiyin, he holds that Ibn Taymiyyah had what's called a nominalist position on universals. And this gets repeated a lot by subsequent writers. And then also many Catholic writers, when they are speaking about the development of modernity and the onset of modernity, they also hold that one of the main culprits, if you want to say, from a Catholic point of view, is William of Ockham. And they held that he introduced a nominalist understanding of universals. And this led to the onset subsequently of people like David Hume, and then you have the Enlightenment thinkers, and then the onset of modernity. So they're seeing kind of a causal link between positions on universals and how that leads to the modern world, essentially, and modernity. Now, in Western, or we should say, in Anglo, thought, the understanding of universals is tied also to the notion of occasionalism in terms of causality, and also the important issue of this idea of voluntarism with regard to ethics. And so these three concepts somehow in the West, in Western thought, are tied together. So the idea of nominalism linked to the idea of when it comes to causality, the notion of occasionalism, and then the third concept of a voluntarist notion of God, where what is good, what is evil is based on, and moral statements is based on what we call divine command theory and God's will, rather than on God's intellect or this intellectualist position in terms of ethics. So in Western thought, these three are linked together. And so voluntarism, occasionalism, and nominalism are seen as the predecessors leading to individuals like David Hume and others, which then you see the Enlightenment and then modernity on that. So this plays a role in that thought as well. And of course, even in evolution, Charles Darwin was considered a nominalist, held a nominalist position on species and essences as well. So this is a very, I think, important topic that we should be paying attention to. One is because we should be, if we want to know the cause of something and what led to the modern world, I think that in modernity, it's important for us to study and to know what are those developments that took place that led to modernity. And number two, we should be concerned as Muslims because in their accounts of how did modernity come about, Muslims and particularly Ash'aris are playing a key role for some reason, right? In this. So I think there's quite a lot of importance, to this topic of universals and their ontological status here. So that's by way of introduction, inshallah. And I guess we're going to set time for question and answer afterwards, or afterwards. Okay, I'm okay if you ask questions as well during. It's not a problem, but we'll stick to the protocol, though, however you set that up, inshallah. So in particular, just to conclude on this introduction, there's a writer, his name is Michael Allen Gillespie. He's a Catholic writer. He wrote a book on the theological origins of modernity. And he's writing from a Catholic perspective. And he's explaining how, what are the foundations of modernity, the theological foundations. And in that, Imam Ghazali, the Ash'ari school, occasionalism, nominalism play a key role in his account. And so, this is, were the Muslims the cause of modernity? That's a question, that's a lot of writers will say yes, apparently. But I think we should have our answer to that question as well. And so as a step towards this, I became interested in this concept of universals. And this is kind of the preliminary results of the study, I guess, that has been there, inshallah. So we'll start, and I'm not going to read word for word what's on the screen. There's a lot that I'll cover, but I'll just summarize in many places, though. So Bismillah, with that, and before we begin, we know that a universal is related to the idea of a particular. So you have a kulli and juzi, or kulliyat and juziyat. And al-kulli is al-mafhum alladhi la yamna'u nafsu tasawwurihi fi wuqu'i ash-sharikati kathirini fihi. So in other words, the kulli is a mafhum, it's a concept. And that concept does not prevent when it's conceived of having multiple particular sharikatu kathirin fihi. In other words, it can be applied, and that universal concept, if you have a concept, if it's a universal, it can be, you can have multiple particulars of that universal, whereas a particular is a concept which you only have one particular of that. And when we study basic texts in logic and mantiq, like the Sulam al-Ulum is advanced text, but the Sulam al-Munawwarak and the Isa-Hoji and other texts like the Shamsiyah, the ulama spend a long time on going through al-Juziyat and Kulliyat and how they apply. So I'm sure you all know that. So I won't revisit those for you, because that's rather basic. But here, let's talk about more, where do these what are some of the discussions around universals? So as I said here, is that universals have played a significant role in the various attempts of philosophers, theologians, and logicians and linguists to generate a coherent account of what is in the mind and how it relates to what is outside the mind. So that's really the question that a lot of these intellectuals, these thinkers, philosophers, theologians, logicians were asking. We have things in our mind, and then we have things that exist extramentally, fil kharij, outside the mind. How do they relate to each other? We have things in our mind that there's no extramental particular of. We have things in our mind that we say are impossible, and there's no extramental particular. How do these concepts relate in the mind, which are in the mind, relate to what is outside the mind? And how do things outside the mind relate to what's in the mind? This was an overall question that philosophers and theologians and logicians were attempting to grapple with. And one of the things that they've answered is this idea of a universal then. And so they say here, the question of universals and their ontological status is a central one in both the Islamic and Latin scholastic traditions, although with different origins and trajectories. Known as a problem of universals in the medieval West, the form the question took, framed by Porphyry in his Istac-Iium, his Aishagoj, where he states the following three, what he calls profound questions, which he sets aside to be answered elsewhere, due to them being metaphysical and not logical questions. And this is something we'll see even in our own Islamic tradition. They're answered in logic texts, but they always preface saying this has nothing to do with the science of logic per se, the ontological status of universals. This has something to do with the proper science is actually metaphysics. It's not logic. So it's not a logical question that a logician would entertain and inquire about. It's a question of metaphysics. So he says that these are three questions. The first question is whether genre or species exist in themselves or reside in mere concepts alone. Number two, whether if they exist, they are corporeal or incorporeal. And number three, whether they exist apart or in sense objects and in dependence on those very sense objects. So these are the three questions historically that Porphyry outlined in his Istac-Iium, and this kind of sets the whole discussion in the Latin West, at least, and even in the Muslim world historically, at how do we discuss universals? These are three fundamental questions. Here, the problem of universals entails ascertaining their ontological status, the ontological status of universals, as genre and species constitute two of the five universal predicables. This question seeks to answer whether universals exist external to the mind or as concepts in the mind with no extramental reality. So if you take the universal like insan, right? Al-insan, if you take this as a concept, does insan or insaniya exist outside the mind? Or does it exist in the mind? Or does it exist in both places? And so we're going to see how they answered this question here. So al-haywaniya, al-insaniya, al-natiqiyya, right? All of these things, these are all then considered universals. What is their status then? And so he says here is that the remaining questions follow from the first. If universals do exist extramentally, do they constitute corporeal or incorporeal objects? And finally, do universals exist extramentally as separate, independent entities? And this is like known as the realist, the Platonic position, where Plato had posited this other world, the world of ideas, right? The world of forms. And that's where universals existed, right? And it was an independent world outside the mind, and we know that Aristotle very aggressively differed with Plato on this, and he denied that there was forms, the world of forms, and for him, universals did not exist independently in this other realm that Plato had posited. And finally, and so all subsequent discussions in the West on the problems of universal took place under this Porphyrian framing of the problem. The questions have captured the intellects of scholars and have come to constitute the origins of Latin scholasticism in the universities of the Middle Ages. The questions set the intellectual world of the 11th century ablaze, according to one historian, generating a spectrum of responses. Generally, the positions of medievals on the questions of universals are divided between a realist understanding on the one hand and anomalous understanding of the other. So you find a whole spectrum of positions on these questions. So the realist camp, right? Let's see here. Scroll down. Yeah. So the realist camp, right? When they say that you are a realist about universals, the realist camp holds that universals have an extra-mental ontological status, a position known as exaggerated realism. This is ascribed to John Scotus and St. Alsam. These are two great thinkers and great scholars of the Latin scholastic tradition. This position maintains that the concept of humanity in Sen, for example, exists externally in the same way it exists mentally, subsisting in particular human beings. Plato's doctrine of universals represents a realist position, but for him, the universal humanity subsists apart from and outside individual men, an ideal which individual men embody or imitate to a lesser or greater extent. So particulars in a Platonic realist scheme participate in universals. They participate in them. Ultra-realism, a position held by William of Champeaux, but which later abandoned, he later abandoned, held that the same essential nature is wholly present at the same time in each of the individual members of the species in question, with the inevitable logical consequence that the individual members of a species differ from one another, not substantially, but only accidentally. William later held what came to be known as indifferentism, where various human beings possess all humanity, but their humanity is not identical numerically, but each humanity is similar to the other. And finally, we have the position of moderate realism. This is ascribed to Thomas Aquinas in his On Being and Essence, De Ente Essentia. Aquinas explains two ways in which a nature or essence may be considered. According to its proper content and according to its existence. And this he takes from Avicenna, where, as we all know, that Ibn Sina, he made this distinction between the existence, being, and essence, right? He made a major, and this is an important contribution in human intellectual thought. Interestingly enough, this distinction, he, according to some scholars, he actually appropriated this distinction from Sunni mutakallimun, actually, who made this distinction between being and essence. Yes. Being is it's wujud and mahiyya. Yeah, wujud. Mahiyya will be the quiddity, the essence, and then the wujud would be its existence. Yeah. So being and existence are two different categories. Yes, conceptually, he made this distinction. Yeah, and Aquinas took this up. You know, he agreed with Avicenna on this, and that's why he states this in this book On Being and Essence. So, and now if we look at it, if you look at this thing, you can distinguish a universal between its proper content and according to the existence the essence has in an extramental particular. So this distinction is very important. The prior theologians didn't make this distinction, right? Prior philosophers didn't make this distinction, but Aquinas brought this into the West due to his heavy reading of Avicenna and others. Yeah. Considered in the second sense, this nature has a twofold existence, one in singular things and the other in the soul. So in other words, this nature, this universal for Aquinas, it has an existence in this particular human, extramentally, and it has an existence in the soul, meaning the mind, he's going to say here. In other words, external reality is only composed of individual particular singulars, yet essences exist as universals only when abstracted. So this process of abstraction that we'll talk about here is when essences are, as universals, are abstracted from these particulars. And abstraction is a mental act carried out by the soul. Thus, essences as universals exist in the soul, not in some Platonic third realm, right? So you see Aquinas he's disagreeing with Plato that these essences don't exist in some other third realm. These universals exist in the soul after a process of abstraction takes place. However, at the same time, essences also exist externally for Aquinas, yet not in a transcendental mode where they are abstract objects subsisting externally, entire apart from their particular instances. Rather, essences exist in particulars in an individual manner, not in a universal manner. So for Aquinas, universals can never, as universals, can never have any extramental reality. Universals as universals are only exist in the soul, and externally only particulars exist. And you'll see our theologians, the Shaira and Ibn Taymiyyah, they would agree a lot. You'll see a lot of similarities between Aquinas and Sunni theologians on this issue too. So for the moderate realist, essences qua essences are neither universal nor individual. Universality and individuality are secondary intelligibles, makulatu thaniya, added to the essence qua essence. So that's kind of the realist camp, right? When we say realism, you have different, even, you know, it's not, even in the realist conception, there are different schools of realists regarding universals. And we're going to see a similar thing with nominalists as well. So you can't speak of one realist school. And similarly, you cannot speak of one nominalist school. There are many different schools who may be nominalists. It is challenging to speak of a single understanding of the nominalist position on universals. Nonetheless, what has been associated with this position is the denial of existence of universal concepts. Usually when you say, currently in Anglophone discourse, usually when you say the term nominalist, what immediately comes to mind is, oh, these people deny universals completely, whether in the mind or whether extramentally as well. And that's not always the case, though. We're going to find out here. And so another term for nominalism is you might find is terminalist, the idea of a term. And so a terminalist position or nominalist position is, they're synonymous in many ways. Yeah. And nominalist is a later type of development. So it's also associated in the West with William of Ockham, right? He's a 14th century scholastic scholar, and he's seen as one of the most well-known representatives of nominalist thought, usually. For Ockham, he says the universal is not something real, having a psychological being in the soul or outside the soul. It has only a logical being in the soul and is a sort of fiction, having some sort of entity in the logical realm as the external thing has in the psychological realm. So this passage here seems to, it's pretty exemplary of William of Ockham's position, where for him, universals have this type of logical being. They don't reside somehow in the soul, and they're not, and what we're going to see here, this process of abstraction, William of Ockham is not really going to agree with, right? And this process of abstraction where universals are formed in the soul. So universals, according to this school, are terms which do not signify something common externally. So when I say, you know, human being, right? What he's going to say here is that in what way can I predicate humans for all of us in this room here, right? If we're going to say, and this is really the question. And so for him, he says universals are terms which do not signify something common externally. In other words, even though we'll predicate human for all of us, it's not something we share in identity, that we have exactly the same human universal or essence by which is being predicated of us. So he says universals in this sense are terms. That hence the word terminalist is also used. That is the term that is being predicated of many. So this is a very important development here. For William of Ockham, the term kulli or juz'i, universal or particular, it describes terms, not concepts, not mafhumat. It describes terms, and it's just a predication of the term to many particulars, which is universal, not the concept which is universal. This is a major difference in a major insight into William of Ockham's position here. In Occam, the concepts are no longer objects of thought, but are collapsed into the cognitive act itself, and we are left with terms which signify a collection of objects rather than a universal idea in the mind. So in other words, if we say, for example, Kuala Lumpur, right, it's, we say everybody, or we can take the term of a nation, Malaysia, for example. Is there an essence to being Malaysian, right? And the same thing in the United States. If you say you're American, is this a nominal, type of predication, right? Or being Malaysian, is it nominal, a type of predication, or is there something being a realist about it, right? There's an essence to being an American and essence to being a Malaysian. I don't get into politics here, but we'll keep that aside, But the idea of national identities comes into play here, right? And so you see how important these concepts are. So just like we draw the borders of France, and those borders can change, depending on what year we're talking about. So what is it that holds every French person in common? Do they share something externally by which they are French, or is it just something nominal and they don't really share something, that's part of who they are? So these are very important questions that come about from how, whether you say something's nominal or not. So differing from this position is conceptualism, commonly associated with Peter of Abelard, which maintains they are abstract objects and universals, yet only in the mind. And this is very, you'll see some similarities in this way towards Muslim theologians as well. Let's see here. The last point here, I think is important. Although I was focusing on Latin, the Latin West, I think it's important for us to recognize, and see, I'm writing from the point of the United States, so this may be different, but from that point of view, writing in the West, we don't, I wanted to make sure that this wasn't just a Western problem, right? Or to see, is it only a Western problem? It turns out that it's not, right? And so some of the things here is to keep in mind. I wrote this paragraph here to say that investigations of the nature of universals and their ontological status in the Latin scholastic tradition were certainly colored and influenced by theological commitments of the various theologians and philosophers belonging to the school. Additionally, translations of the work of the Islamic tradition have certainly had an impact on the nature of the debate in the scholastic tradition. For example, one cannot deny the prominence of Avicenna and Averroes, the commentator, Ashari, in Aquinas' De Ente Essentia. This fact in no way takes away from the creativity and independence of Aquinas, yet it does demonstrate that such inquiries were conducted within traditions more porous than perhaps may be assumed. Indeed, we see the questions of universals being a topic of inquiry in the Buddhist and the Hindu philosophical traditions as well. Here we find METAPHYSICS realist position on universals invoking strong nominalist objections from the Buddhists. So in general, Buddhists have been holding a nominalist position on universals, it turns out. Again, not all Buddhists, but and then Hindus have been taking a more realist position on universals. This led to the development of the Buddhist nominalist theory of apoha, where general terms can be used without assuming the existence of universals. Here, Buddhists developed the exclusion differentiation theory of cognition, where the term like cow signifies all things that are not cows. You see, and so there's no essence to cows. All we're saying here is that cow means everything that is not a cow, right? And so it's a very different way of looking at things here. And they use in their books of logic and their books of metaphysics, the Buddhists use instead of human, they use the word a teapot. So I guess they drink a lot of tea. And so they go, when is a teapot, and when is a teapot not a teapot? So it's very interesting. So the point of appreciation here is that one finds the very same metaphysical topics addressed by adherents of different faith traditions. Their theological commitments shape their manner and responses to these topics, along with their engagement and reception of contribution from other faith traditions. So this is not something that's just to be seen as a European Western problem, although it is, but it seems like all different civilizations were grappling with the same metaphysical questions, but in their own ways too. And they have their own solutions to this, and it's no different than our Islamic tradition, although the Islamic tradition covers a variety of different cultures, right, and different continents. So it's really nice to see that. So what I'll do, this kind of ends the kind of the introduction to this topic here. And what I can do is I can take, if there are any questions, I can take maybe 1 or 2 questions, and then we can move to get into some of the more details. Is that okay? Or should I just continue until the end of the hour or something? Whatever you suggest.
Yeah, I think if there are any questions from the brother, please.
My name is Faisal.
Yeah.
I'm from Istac. So what's exactly the difference of Kalam's version of nominalism and Occam's version?
Well, in my paper here, I think to say that the Kalam position is nominalist is a mistake. Yeah, I don't see how we can say. It depends on how we define nominalism, first of all. But if we define nominalism, even in the Occam's conception of nominalism, I don't think I haven't found any Sunni mutakallim or philosopher who's ever held that their position on universals is you can't describe it as nominalist. And even Ibn Taymiyyah's position, once the study that I provided here, I cannot say he's a nominalist. Yeah. So, yeah, one can look into that, but when you look at their actual position, they affirm, first of all, that particular things have essences, and they affirm what Professor Atas calls an ontological essence and then a logical essence, right? And ma hiya bima'na al-'am wa ma hiya bima'na al-akhas. And so they affirm that. No nominalist affirms that I've encountered. I have encountered a nominalist and affirmed that, because what they're saying here is that the Sunnis, and even Ibn Taymiyyah will affirm this, universal doesn't exist outside the mind. Universals exist solely in the mind, right? So they do acknowledge universals exist, and they do, and they don't, and it's not just the term, the word insan that's being predicated in a universal manner. It's the mafhum, it's the concept insan. And there's no nominalist who really holds that position. And based on that, it's very difficult to say that the scholars that I've looked at here and Ibn Taymiyyah hold a nominalist position, because a nominalist denies the formation of a concept, a mafhum. And all of our scholars affirm the process of abstraction, right? And so the aql, the intellect, abstracts from the particular and goes through this idea of abstraction. After the process of abstraction, the mafhum, the concept, forms in the soul. And the fact that they affirm a concept forms, and it's the concept that's universal, that itself, I think, puts them outside the nominalist camp, of any of the whole spectrum of nominalist camp, I think, yeah. That's a great question. And right now, I mean, my suggestion is, it's not that it's a useless exercise to say, are they realists or nominalists? I don't think we need to categorize ourselves. I think even this realist nominalist thing, it's more of a Western type of approach, to this. So there's nothing wrong with it to say, okay, we fall maybe within this, I think on some issues, we could be nominalists. On some issues, we're realists. We're not either in those camps, And so that's one approach, is to say, I don't think we need to bother so far with, to try to categorize us, whether we're nominalists or not. It's kind of like natural law, theory. Do Muslims have a natural law, and they are right, they are thinkers and legal theorists who want to write and say, no, we do have a natural law and all that. But I think if you let our tradition speak on its own terms, and and what I found is maybe on some issues we might hold a nominalist position, maybe in other issues we don't hold a nominalist position. We don't fit too neatly in one of these categories or the other. So, and I think we should leave it at that. We should just speak on our own terms. That's kind of my position. I don't know. You tell me if you agree or not. What are your thoughts? Because I think unfortunately it's caused some confusion. You know, when they want to say Ibn Taymiyyah is anomalous, I just don't see that. I just don't see that. And then people use that conclusion, unfortunately, to, you know, to say many things like, oh, you know, modernity or, you know, started with Ibn Taymiyyah. It's like, I'm sorry, we can't say that because he was anomalous. And then, you know, and Ash'ari, it turns out they're not anomalous at all, you know. So I think it does a disservice, you know, to say that.
You said who claimed that Ibn Taymiyyah is the
Wal Halak. You know, Wal Halak, he's a Lebanese Christian. I can't say definitively, but he was the first. I haven't done research to see was he the first, but Wal Halak, I mean, he's still alive, you know. Yeah, and he wrote The Impossible State and other books, but he's at least he's the one who's the most popular who said that. You know, he's one of the most well-known figures who said that. Yeah, and then other people are repeating that too. Yeah, yeah.
Regarding the non-existence, he rejects the existence of mental existence, basically. And his definition of knowledge, al-ilm, is actually a nisbah between one object to another, between it's not the imprintment of forms into the soul, which are held by the philosophers. Yeah. So how about that position?
So mental existence has to do, again, this is another important topic, wujud dhihni. And I think there's a lot of also kind of confusion on what do the scholars mean, the theologians, philosophers, what do they mean when they say wujud dhihni? I think even amongst themselves, sometimes I think they're talking past each other because they don't define what they mean at least clearly enough by what they mean by wujud dhihni, you know. So if you take some of the examples like of those who deny wujud dhihni, they would say, well, if I think of fire, well, if wujud dhihni was true, my mind doesn't get hot and burn up though when I think of fire. So the question here is like, well, what are they talking about then when they deny wujud dhihni, you know? That's really, I think, what, you know, I spend, I was trying to like, well, okay, wire is obvious. No one would say, no intelligent person would say that if I think of fire, then my mind, fire exists in my mind, you know? So obviously, wujud dhihni, what does it really mean? What does it really refer to? So I think, in my estimation, one of the best individuals who kind of, you know, identified what the point of difference is, that Tahrir Mahal al-Niza, is al-Galambawi, actually, the 18th century Ottoman scholar. And in one of his works on logic, he basically identified the dispute over wujud dhihni is over what. And this really helped me when I found what he said. He said that the question of wujud dhihni is really over, can you say that the same identical essence of a thing, right, the mahiyya, has two separate realms of existence, the exact identical one. So in other words, if you were to see a fire, right, can you say that that particular fire, the essence of that fire, exists fil kharij, extramentally, in that fire, and also the exact identical one exists in my mind? That's the dispute. And the mutakallimun will say no. And then the other schools, and there's different schools on wujud dhihni, by the way, there's not only two, there's like 4 or 5 different positions on it. But those who affirm wujud dhihni will say, no, it's the identical one that exists in the mind as well. Oh, how do they answer the question? If it's the identical one, then why don't the athar, the effects of fire, yeah, they're in the kharij, why don't they go in the mind? They said, then they came up with this concept of wujud dhilli, right? It's not a it doesn't have wujud in the sense of wujud al-asili, which is concrete existence. بمعنى ما يترتب عليه الآثار. What they say is that existence is in which all the qualities manifest. That's wujud al-khariji. The wujud dhihni is wujud dhilli. It's a modified, weaker sense of wujud, in which the athar do not, you don't see any effects of that athar. So that's one position. And then the mutakallimun will say, no, it's not the exact identical, numerically identical essence, mahia, it's a different essence that the mind abstracts from it. Or at least, the knowledge will have there. So, and from my understanding too, Imam Fakhruddin Razi was the first to even call it wujud dhihni. And he has, in his Mab'ath al-Mashriqiyya, he's the first to have a whole section proper on wujud dhihni. So his discussion is very early, and then it develops after him, to a much larger discussion on wujud dhihni. Allahu Alam, I don't know, that's all I can share at this point.
Maybe the practical purpose of making the distinction or making the similarities between the two wujuds is basically for ease of analysis and to escape from confusion.
Perhaps, yeah.
Maybe that's why this was one of the most important topics.
It was really important. Absolutely, yeah. It was and it's hotly debated in our tradition, the idea of wujud dhihni. Yeah.
There's a question, if I may ask.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yes, there's a question from the Zoom. Some people say the discussion on universals are not important in the Islamic theological discourse. What is important is the discourse on existence and essence. Please comment.
I'll let you all comment on that.
It's a long topic.
For me, I would definitely say that, when we say existence and essence, I think when we use the word essence, that's where universals enter into the picture, right? If we're, when we're asked to explore the idea of a mahiyya, right, and the various ways in which the word mahiyya is conformed, this is exactly what the, ulama from different philosophical schools were talking about when they said universal. So I think it's almost inescapable in that way. Universals are inescapable. You have to talk about them. You have to account for them as well. You have to account for them. And all of these attempts were basically attempts to account for universals in some way. And whether they say they're universals of terms or universals of the concept, they're still trying to account for them. So when you say like, this is a chair, that's a chair, that's a chair, a chair is a noun. Well, what type of noun is it? Is it a generic noun? And how do all these particulars come under this generic noun of chair, right? How do you form plurals? And that's why grammar is incredibly important, right? Incredibly important. And much of our discourse in Nahu and Balagha and even Wada and Malwada, the science of word imposition, universals comes up in there, right? You can't really escape it, is what I would say. It's very hard to escape it. And even when you use the word essence, that universals enter the picture right there. That's what I don't know, what would you say?
This is a question from Zoom.
Yes.
I think, can we check that any people in the Zoom want to?
Yeah, that was the only question.
I mean, you can ask them.
Yeah.
Okay, our viewers in the Zoom, anyone wants to comment or ask a question, please raise your hand. We will take up your questions and comments, inshallah. Okay, now we'll give them some.
No, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm struggling to see how do you fit in this universe? How do you fit Tawheed inside that universe?
How do you fit? Can you repeat that?
Tawheed. How does Tawheed fit into the universe you're talking about? Thank you.
Into the cosmos, the Adam?
Yeah. Into the whole discussion of universals.
Oh, into the discussion of universals. Oh, okay. Wow. I need to think about that. Well, I mean, they are. I mean, I'm not sure if I understand the question. I mean, it's. If I do, I understand it. It's a probably 2-hour answer, you know. But I don't think that we have time for that. But you know, how do universals? Does this come up in ilm al-tawhid and regarding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And the answer is yes. So if you take the word al-ilah, or sorry, not al-ilah, but ilah, right? Is ilah a kulli or is it a juz'i? For example, right? And you know, so what's the answer to that question? What would you say? Mafhum al-ilah, right? Is that a kulli or is that a juz'i? I can help. Yeah. So most of our ulama, you know, from what I understand, they said it's a kulli. Ilah is a kulli, right? And this is important because, you know, obviously the word ilah can be plural, and aliha, right? And so you can the word ilah, the term ilah, the mafhum of ilah, it is, you can predicate it of multiple different particulars, right? And so this comes up here, you know, then what do we mean by this term? How do we understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and divine beings? And how do we understand, you know, even the lafzul jalala, Allah, right? It's that's important because it's a proper noun, right? It's an alam, right? It's not a kulli, right? In that sense. So ilah could be a kulli, right? Allah, lafzul jalal, is not a kulli, it's a juz'i, meaning because it's only applied to one particular being, right? So to answer your question briefly, you know, the idea of a kulli or juz'i does come up in that way, at least. I'm sure there's more in this too. And even the idea of the sifat, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, sifat of Allah ta'ala, are they kulliyat or not? They're not kulliyat. The sifat are not kulliyat, right? Yeah. Allahu alam. I don't know if I answered your question or not.
I think it will become much clearer as we go into the further into the page.
Yeah, let's do that.
Continue.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah.
Yes. Bismillah.
All right, so here now it's important to understand that we have what's called there is a background of you know, when you look at Sunni theologians, their discourse is, the background of their discourse, a major figure is Avicenna, right, Ibn Sina. And so I'm just going to go through here a bit of how Avicenna set this question, right? How did he influence the discussion amongst Sunni metaphysicians and scholars? So but you know what I say here is that the treatment of the formation of universals and their ontological status by Sunni scholars spans the texts of logic, theology, and metaphysics. You see it in all of these different works. Worthy of note is when the ontological status of universals is treated in books of logic, it is usually seen as a topic alien to the science. One finds the Ash'ari theologian Sa'duddin Tabtazani beginning his discussion on the existence of the natural universal of kulli al-tabi'i, which we'll talk about, in his commentary on the logic manual Ash-Shamsiyya, stating that this issue is outside the science of logic, even though he's talking about it in a book of logic. He wants to make sure that's clear. Yet it is the custom of logicians to discuss the issue in texts of logic. Similarly, Qutbuddin al-Razi, who was prior to, he was a student of al-Abhari, observes in his commentary on the same manual that inquiry into this issue falls outside the craft of logic. But Tabtazani reasons that logic is concerned with apprehensions and assents, tasawwarat wa tasdiqat, two acts of the mind aimed at arriving at an unknown, a majhul, which are not related to the existence or non-existence of the natural universal externally. So logic doesn't really concern whether the natural universal exists externally or not. It's just concerned about the ma'qulat al-thaniya, the tasawwarat and tasdiqat. Now he says here, what science should investigate the question? Al-Razi suggests that the proper science to investigate this question is metaphysics, al-hikmah al-ilahiyya, which investigates the existent qua existent. Thus, it is a metaphysical question, despite being found in books of logic. Yet it is not solely treated in the books of logic, as our study will take us through various works of theology, kalam, theology, and metaphysics. And by and large, the inquiry into universals and their ontological status in the post-classical tradition has been set by Avicenna in his works on logic and metaphysics, which he acknowledges as being inherited from his predecessors. So even Avicenna in the Shifa, it's not something sui generis from Avicenna. He acknowledges there's people before him who have talked about this, and he's continuing the conversation here. Avicenna's treatment of universals has been received by Ash'ari scholars, as can be seen in their standard works of logic and metaphysics. It would consequently be prudent to provide Avicenna's treatment of universals as it is a backdrop for discussions by Sunni scholars. So Avicenna discusses three ways the term universal is used. So the word kulli, there's three ways he talks about it. He says the universal is spoken of in three ways. Universal is said of the meaning, right? And that's a keyword, meaning, by way of its being actually predicated of many. For example, the human being. Universal is also predicated of a meaning if it is permissible for it to be predicated of many, even if it is not a condition that these should exist in actuality. In other words, you can have a universal. There does not need to be a particular instantiation of it, which instantiates that universal. That's very different than Plato's conception of universals, right? Where for every universal, you need a particular instantiation of it. And so here he's agreeing with Aristotle, Avicenna, on this case. And this, you'll see Sunni scholars will agree with him here as well. And he always gives this example, a heptagonal house, right? Avicenna, and I don't know where he got this example from, but he says, a heptagonal house is a universal, but there's no particular of a heptagonal house. And I guess in his time, people didn't have heptagonal houses. So for it is a universal in as much as it is in its nature to be predicable of many, but it does not follow necessarily that these many must exist. And that's an important distinction. Nay, not even one of. And then the third way is universal is also said of the meaning of whose very conception does not prevent its being predicated of many. That's what we talked about as mafhum الذي لا يمنع من تصوره شركة كثيرين فيه. So those are the three ways the term kulli is being used. This passage of Avicenna's Shifa captures his conception of the universal and the various usages of the term. One observes that the basis of Avicenna's conception is on predication. A universal is a meaning, a ma'na, considered from the aspect of its predicability. If this meaning is predicable of many, then it is universal. If not, then it is a particular. Now, Avicenna considers a relationship between predication and the meaning from three perspectives. Thus, one, a meaning can actually be a predicable of many, as in the case of the human being. Two, it can be possible or potentially predicable of many while not actually so, such as the heptagonal house. And three, the actual conception of the meaning does not prevent it from being predicated of many, such as the sun and the earth. It is this third usage, a meaning whose very conception does not prevent it from being predicated of many, which Avicenna takes for the rest of the discussion on universals. And so this forms the background of a lot of the Sunni discussions on this. And what I'll do is go to, having gone through the background, I'll now go through like specifically what Sunni scholars have to say about this. And so here, when we get to post-classical Ash'ari theologians' treatments of universals, what we want to do is first, what are some tenets of Ash'ari's ontological commitments which relate to our inquiry of their theory of universals? Ash'ari theologians maintain that external reality is composed solely of individuals, afrad. At-Taftazani states in a number of places in his theological Summa Sharh al-Maqasid that existence such as human, for example, are only Zayd, Amr, and other individuals. There is no absolute human, right? Insan mutlaq existing externally. And that's an important statement because he's clarifying his conception, his ontological conception. And when people see this, they say, okay, if externally they are only particulars, then somehow they could say, oh, this is a nominalist position. In fact, it's not a nominalist position, just to say particulars only exist, right? And that I think it's important not to be hasteful and to read a bit more into this, and study more before making that conclusion. So here we see that the external realities compose only of particulars which exclude the existence of abstract essences. In other words, the Platonic third realm, right? That's being denied here, such as human, independent of any particular. As for its existence in a particular, we will address this when we discuss the natural universal. Building on this position, the Teptazani deals with the ontological status of the five particles, saying, in external existence, they are only particulars, ashkhas, while the genus, the gens, differentia, fossil, and species, and noah, are only differentiated forms in the intellect, in the akal. So in logic, when we say this is a gens, fossil, and noah, those are only mental or intellectual distinctions that are made. For the Kharij, right, externally, it's only one entity that exists, right? So this is a very important way of how they see particulars. External existence are not constituted by a composite of various abstract essences, such as human, rationality, or color, nor is it the case that these essences do not exist, though. So even though the human being is not composed of these many essences, these are all mental abstractions, it doesn't mean that they deny essences either. They affirm them, but they affirm them in the mind, is where what we'll see here. So he says the color black, for example, is not achieved by the combination of abstract essence, color, or essence taking away of sight. That's the privation. Rather, essences, abstracted and formulated as an act of the mind, and therefore are mentally posited entities having no extramental existence. So the mahiyat they're abstracted, and we're talking here about the logical universal. And so, and we'll see here, one of the great Ottoman scholars, he actually describes here how the process of abstraction in Tiza takes place. So he says here, Tash-Kubri-Zada will say, he'll say here is that the soul, by means of a distinct faculty which Allah has set in it and fashioned it with, abstracts essences subsisting in God's active knowledge. This is really interesting. So what are the forces? Where are these essences located, so to speak, right? I put it in quotes. You know, many different philosophers had different theories. You know, for Ibn Rushd, it was one intellect, right? Universal intellect that all human beings supposedly, would gain their knowledge from. For Avicenna and others, it was the active intellect, Aql Fa'al, and things like this. And we see Sunni scholars are saying here, it's actually these essences are subsisting God's active knowledge. So they're eliminating these type of intelligences, these uqul, and they're not ascribing to a type of theory of emanation or things like that. So here he says here, subsisting in God's active knowledge from external objects. This knowledge is termed al-ilm al-infi'ali, receptive knowledge, because the soul receives these forms from external objects. The notion of abstraction in Tiza refers to the form of a particular object. Form of a particular occurs in an instrument of the soul. I mean here, he says the quwwatul khayaliyah, he talked about the imaginative faculty. It then readies and prepares the soul to have emanated onto it a universal corresponding to that particular, which is present in the imagination. Consequently, from the divesting away of individual properties, hadful mushakhasat, of these particulars and essence forms in the soul which corresponds to them. So this is a very clear example of how an essence forms, and I can't find a nominalist who would agree with this. They would deny this whole process really takes place, and this is really because this is why the question is really, does the soul or does the mind, whatever you want to say, form concepts? Does it form essences, right? So it's very difficult to say that here. And Ibn Taymiyyah would agree with this to a large extent. He would agree with this, and that's why it's hard to say that. So, I go on to explain this passage of Tash-Kubri-Zada, but a key point here is that his account, it demonstrates that for Ash'ari theologians, it is not the intellect, which imposes these categories. This is a very Kantian perspective, right? So as you know from Immanuel Kant, it is the mind has categories it cannot escape, and it imposes them on external objects. For Ash'ari theologians, it's the external objects that form and impose their knowledge on the soul. It's a very different perspective here. The external object's form is captured by the external senses, which is a phantasm, by which a phantasm is produced, phantasia. The soul, via abstraction, forms the essence. At this stage, the essence, for example, humanity, insaniya, is not a universal at this stage. Universal comes at a later stage, right? So you can have a concept, insaniya, then the soul says, okay, is this a particular or is it a universal? So humanity itself is not a universal. The soul will say, can it be predicated? So once the essence is abstracted at a later stage, subsequent stage, is where the question of particularity or universality is asked, right? And then that can be described, the concept of insaniya is later than, at a later stage, assessed to be either universal or a particular. Yes. Yes.
In America right now,
Yes.
is there any Christian philosopher or theologian who is revisiting this debate in the past between that debate regarding the nominalists and the realists? And given the situation now is different in America, is there any conversations, say, between people like you and the Christians, I mean, or Jewish, on this question? I'm asking this question because the historical background is the problem of nominalism is related to that whole issue of the Platonic approach and the Aristotelian approach. The two, the conflict, which of course Al-Farabi reconciled that. In other words, the idea of the ideas, the Plato ideas, and whereas the Aristotelian approach is basically going from multiplicity to unity, which means we have to bring in now the issue also of hierarchy of universals. So is that hierarchy of universals something that you are giving thought that?
The question, to answer the question, I would say they definitely are conversations happening. I myself have talked to different, Dominicans, Catholic Dominicans, and Franciscans about this issue too. And I presented the paper to them as well, and they appreciated it. And then I've also presented the paper to analytic philosophers as well. So even in what you could call, a non-theistic philosophical school like analytic philosophy, and although they don't use the terms perhaps as our theologians and philosophers use, they would say even in contemporary analytic philosophy, they pretty much are coming up with the same type of solutions or various solutions to the problem of universals as well. And of course, they're not going to, when it comes to analytic philosophers, they're not tied specifically to a particular school of theology, right? And some of them are not religious at all. Some of them, you find Catholics who are analytic philosophers and as well. And so with analytic philosophers, they do approach this issue, but they may not necessarily be tied to a particular religious faith. But they do come up with similar types of conversations. After I was speaking with them, that was the feedback he gave to me. He said that, Omar, what you described here is very similar, not identical, but very similar to what analytic philosophers are saying too on this issue. So both in analytic philosophy and also in amongst Catholics, at least, those are the this is definitely being discussed, this issue and the implications of it, and particularly because you have many of the social sciences, and particularly postmodernism, that many postmodernists are usually subscribed to a type of nominalism, where language does not signify reality, anything external. Language is kind of a self-referential system, right? And it doesn't point to anything outside of itself, right? And so this is where you get people like Derrida and others, right, who have these ideas about language and what does language refer to. So a lot of, in our times, postmodern approaches to knowledge definitely it's really hard not to be a nominalist. You pretty much are committing yourself to a type of nominalism. So so these are the type of conversations that are happening on this. Yes, absolutely. I don't know if I answered your question, inshallah. Yeah.
When you mentioned that, I brought up the question of hierarchy of university.
Could you explain that part again? Yeah.
I mean, if we look at what we call abstraction, in other words, the kinds of different levels of mafhum.
Yeah.
You know, in what's happening in the mind. Precisely the mind. I mean, you are in the field of originally the field of biology or the. In others, you basically your field studying forms, studying forms of plants, forms of animals, and forms of human, because the mind is engaged with the kind of study of things which have different forms in the front.
Yeah.
Now that's why I thought it was something good. I mean, for the peripatetic philosophers in the past to talk about the search for knowledge, acquisition of knowledge, is basically trying to extract the forms that are more and more universal. In other words, it's not ever, as I mentioned, a hierarchy. In the same, you have both ascending as well as descending.
Yeah.
The Platonic approach is descending in the sense from the ideas. The Platonic ideas are the most, the highest form of universal.
Yeah, they're the most real.
Yeah, in fact, they refer to the Asma al-Husna, the divine name. That's one interpretation of Platonic. The good, the idea of those ideas. So, therefore, direct descent of form. In other words, going from unicity to more and more multiplicity.
Yeah.
Whereas the Aristotle is going ascending that way.
Yeah.
Start with the empirical things, then and you want to extract universal knowledge out of the our experience with the empirical world.
Yeah.
So that was the beginning that led to the debate later on in the West between the nominalists and the realists, because they could not reconcile between the two approaches. They are not, in principle, they are not opposed to each other. Whether you start from up and up and going down, or you're going from low to going to, you meet, So I think it was the tawheed of the Muslim, the philosophers, that were able to unify the two, to synthesize the two approaches.
Yeah.
So there were no problem. Yeah. So Plato and Aristotle were not a problem. But in the West, it was different. I think when you talk about the rise of the occasionalists, William Ockham and so on, the debate was different already. So now you mention the language has no meaning anymore. I mean, does not correspond to reality. I mean, they're going to the end of the road already, basically. That's how I see.
Yeah.
Western thinking, what we call reductionism, they have reached the limit. They cannot reduce anymore. That's why we don't no meaning. Language is a form of no meaning. The same way, logic. Does that logic really correspond to something ontological reality? We say yes.
We say yes. They say
yes.
Yeah.
But many of the Western thinkers no.
They say no. Yeah.
So I think that is the issue. But the issue you raised earlier, why the issue is relevant to modernity? That's interested. Now, if you talk now, I think it tells us something when people now, Muslims now, say allege or claim that Ibn Taymiyyah is a nominalist. The claim that or this is whatever even the opposite.
Realist.
So I think that is the issues that what you present these are the issues that are being raised.
They're racial.
Yeah, they're being raised. I think we need to address
Absolutely.
that.
No, I think your point here about, for us, it wasn't an either or. I think what we just read from Taj Kubrizada, he just shows that these universal forms come from God's knowledge, and then they get there's a faith that comes to the soul of the human, and it accounts for the particular, the higher level, and the universal. It accounts for both. From the multiplicity to the unity of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's knowledge, and both. I think what you're seeing here with the Ash'ari school, I think they're accounting for both in a beautiful way.
It's talking about ma'rifatullah.
No, not here. Yeah, this is not ma'rifah. This is just normal ways of knowing. Yeah.
Just
No.
Yeah, ma'rifah is a different issue.
Yeah.
So that's higher than this.
Yeah.
other stuff.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's because that's of Allah subhanahu wa
So
ta'ala.
this
Yeah.
is the knowledge that, what's his name?
Taj Kubrizada. Yeah.
I think it's very interesting, Prof. Yeah. I think it's very interesting. Just take the phenomena of revelation, right?
Yeah.
Revelation. That descent of the Quran that finally reached and become in the Arabic language.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of issue there. Huh? The message from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Quran in the Lawh Mahfuz, that comes down, and what form does it take finally?
Arabic.
And this is imprinted in the soul of the Prophet ﷺ. In Arabic.
Yeah.
It's the Arabic Quran.
Yeah.
And Arabic is just one of the languages. But how that the phenomena, how the universal descends into the particular.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bakr. Thank you.
If you can go back to this
Yeah.
and explain how is that possible for him to get the knowledge? Is it from God? I think you've not finished this part. Yeah.
Yeah, we have it right there. Yeah. So what happens here, what Taj Kubrizada is saying here, is that, so he's saying is that he's affirming that it's the soul, right, that does carry on this process of abstraction. But it starts from, it starts from this, for the human being, for us, it starts from this world of multiplicity. We're looking at particular objects. From those particular objects, right, these external objects here, right, he says here is that this knowledge is termed receptive knowledge. So what we get from the objects is called ilmul infiadi, because the soul receives the forms from these external objects, right? But then it does this whole process of intiza, abstraction. Now, the soul, then the khayal, when it gets ready, then Allah Ta'ala, from His knowledge, reveals to the soul the universal. So you see, in one theory, you have everything together, the multiplicity of the world, and then the unity of Allah Ta'ala's knowledge, And so he says but that all depends on, and this is, and this universal corresponds to that particular, that extramental particular. But where does that universal come from? That comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's a process of faith that he invokes that. And because that's what he says earlier, and yafida alayha. So there's a faith from Allah Ta'ala, His knowledge. And that knowledge from Allah Ta'ala is called ilm al-fi'li. It's Allah's knowledge is called ilm al-fi'li, because that's how it is. And so so it's a very different, way, and I think it's, as Dr. Bakr was saying, it combines both the multiplicity and unity. And we're in the West, there were either or, for Muslims were like, it's not either or, Yeah. So this is a very nice example of how the Ash'aris conceive of this formation of universals and things like this. And then in the next section of the paper, I just go to towards Ibn Taymiyyah's conception here. And Ibn Taymiyyah basically he didn't have a detailed theory of abstraction, but he did have a theory of abstraction that it imprints on the soul, all of these forms, these particular forms, and then it forms a universal here. So yeah, and I just state that there's been some interest in Ibn Taymiyyah's theory of universals among Western scholars, notably Al-Halak and the great Greek logicians, Abu Ya'rub al-Marzuki. He has a book, Islah al-Aql fi al-Falsafat al-Arabiya, and he talks about, Urus al-Falaton ila Ismiyat, right? Ismiyat, nominalism of Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Khaldun. He also, Ibn Khaldun is a nominalist too, which I didn't spend my paper talking about that, but But in any case, even in the West, though, there is, so Ibn Taymiyyah does have he has a risala, Qa'idatun fi Kulliyat. If it's in your manuscript library, I'd like to see. I've been trying to look for the manuscript of this. It hasn't been published yet, but it's something I want to look into. I haven't looked into that, but I looked at different works of Ibn Taymiyyah. He talks about Kulliyat all over his writings. They play obviously an important issue for him. But basically, Ibn Taymiyyah himself, as he states, Ibn Taymiyyah will state that universals are only in the mind. So, and as for what exists externally, it is a particular, specific to itself, not a universal. So you see here, he's pretty much stating the same. He has the same ontology as our Ash'ari theologians had, and he says here, the one who holds that a universal exists external to the mind has made an error. You see, and this is something that Ash'aris would be in great agreement with, and even Avicenna would be in agreement with. So he says, for a universal is only ever a universal in the mind, not in the concrete. Externally, there are only particulars. And then he goes on to explain all of these, he goes on to explain all of these things, And he, on a side note, this basically, I won't spend going into much detail about Ibn Taymiyyah's theory of universals, but what we can know is that he's pretty much in agreement with what the Ash'ari will hold, and even Avicenna as well on this thing. So I can basically, I can end it here, and we can take some more questions and discussions because it's 11:26 right now. So we can do that if you don't mind.
Yeah, before that, because the brother has raised a question first. You want to ask a question? Yes, please. Bismillah.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Sorry. Okay, so basically, you were talking about universal and also nominal issue. So I was thinking about these issues. When it comes to abstraction, the problem is, I was reading Richard Dawkins yesterday. He was talking about the evolutionary psychology. So what happened is that when the concept of universal, just now you mentioned, I read the quotation, universal is in the mind only. So, however, when it comes to evolutionary psychology, the way they try to describe is kind of, abstraction do exist. However, it is coming from the evolutionary process. So that's how they try to explain, as I was reading. And also he was arguing about the categorical imperative of Immanuel Kant, that how this actually does not exist, that is coming from evolutionary process. So how, when it comes to Islamic philosophers, how do they see it?
How do they see
this kind of thing?
Abstraction?
Because for me, I feel like, okay, when it comes to evolutionary psychology, it's going back rather than, because religions evolved very later. And the way they try to say is coming from through our evolutionary process from long period of time. So how, when it comes to Islamic philosophers, how do they see these kind of things?
Yeah, they don't see it as from an evolutionary perspective. Even evolution as it is now, right? It's the theory of evolution wouldn't allow for any, what they would call any non-material explanation or immaterial explanation for any phenomena they see. Any phenomena has to have a natural cause. So they would not see the soul. The soul will not come into their into how they explain reality, right? A priori, they would exclude the soul from any type of explanation of natural phenomena. So even when they talk about evolutionary psychology, it's not like they're studying the soul. They're studying what they believe to be just material and natural, observations of the natural world and how human beings function. Our, theologians here will not take an entirely different perspective. As you see here, the formation of universals and how, and the process of abstraction, it's an act of the soul. It's not an act of the material body. The role of the material body, it does play a role, but that's in sensory knowledge of sensing the particular, right? But in the formation of the universal, right? So according to Avicenna, Avicenna would say you know, the body, the material body senses a particular, and the soul only forms universals. For Ash'ari theologians, the soul itself perceives universals and particulars, right? So there is a difference, you know, and that's based on their metaphysics, you know, that we don't have to get into now. But everything we're talking about, the formation of particulars, the perception of particulars, and the formation of universals, is an act of the soul. Whereas evolutionary psychologists, they won't even concede the soul exists, right? And also, all of this has to take place and can only be explained by invoking natural causes or natural phenomena, let alone and not immaterial. Yeah, that'd be a major difference in those two. Yeah.
Yes, brother, please.
Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah. Myself, Sayyid Usman Gilani, I'm from Istac. My question is, there are two philosophers like Descartes and Pascal. They have some different theories about our topic. Because Descartes says, I am thinking, therefore I am. And Pascal said that I think my heart feels which my mind never feel like this. So what do you think that regarding our Muslim mufakkirun on this topic and these two Western philosophers? I think the West has also disturbed with their theories. So what do you think about their theories regarding our topic? Because we have some very deep research on this. So I just want to more focus on these philosophers' theories. Thank you so much.
That's a good question. Unfortunately, I haven't really went into what Descartes or Pascal have said about this issue. I haven't looked into it that much. Most of my research in the West is with the Latin scholastic tradition. So unfortunately, I haven't looked into Descartes or Pascal in terms of what they said about this. But that's something I'll look into, inshallah. It's a good area to look into.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
So how important, how central is the concept of Nasl al-Amr to the Ash'arites? Because as far as I know, the Masha'iyun, including Hassan Spike himself, he said that the concept of Nafs al-Amr is important to the in relation to the objectivity and finding objective truth in Islam as compared to the subjectivism of the West. So can we do without the concept of Nafs al-Amr and still maintaining objective reality in as far as the Sunni metaphysics is concerned?
That's a great question, and of course a whole other lecture on Nafs al-Amr. But Nafs al-Amr is a very important metaphysical concept in our tradition, right? And the idea of Nafs al-Amr plays a role in truth, right? So what is the truth maker of a proposition, for example, right? So if I have a proposition that Zayd is standing, or any proposition, the truth maker is, does it correspond to ma fi nafs al-amr? Does it correspond to that which it is in reality? The question here is Nafs al-Amr, what does it mean though, right? So even for Tash Kubrizada and all the Ash'ari theologians, Nafs al-Amr is all over. It's in our books of fiqh, it's in our books of hadith, it's in our books of nahu. It's a very important concept, and it plays a role in the truth maker of propositions and ahkam, judgments. Now, Nafs al-Amr, what does it refer to is the question. And the ulama have stated various things as to what it's referred to. The question is there a real difference of opinion or amongst our scholars as to what does Nafs al-Amr refer to or not? Or is the question they're giving different examples of what Nafs al-Amr refers to? So in other words, they're not contradictory. They're just giving different examples of what Nafs al-Amr referred to. So in general, Nafs al-Amr refers to, one of the things it refers to is the al-mawjud al-khariji, like the external, the concrete existent. So it does refer to that. That's nafs al-amr. The question is, does nafs al-amr refer to what's in the mind? And because we can have a judgment, a proposition, for example, shariq al-bari mumtani', right? That, you know, for Allah Ta'ala to have, for there to be a partner or a co-share with God, it's impossible. Well, how do we know that's true? What does it correspond to? Because some people say, well, that means that you have to do ithbat of a shariq in order to negate a shariq, and it must correspond to something for kharij, so you're affirming it, and it leads to all these different types of absurdities. So the ulama also say, well, nafs al-amr refers to, as we talked about, al-wujud al-khariji, but it also refers to al-wujud al-dhihni. That's what's in the mind. So hence, a statement like shariq al-bari mumtani', what we're looking, when we're trying to see if it's true or not, this truth maker is not an external existence, it's a mental existence. Now the ulama also talk about nafs al-amr, a third locus for nafs al-amr, and that they also say is the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So the knowledge of Allah ta'ala is another place, another locus for which makes propositions true or false too. Like in terms of, does the proposition correspond to nafs al-amr? So it refers to basically broadly three things, you know, the external existence, what's in the mind, and what's in and then the knowledge of God, of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Some ulama mentioned the Lawh al-Mahfuz, all of these things too. Those are just examples, right? But that's, you know, the Lawh al-Mahfuz ultimately represents knowledge, God's knowledge, right? In that case. So those are the three ideas of what nafs al-amr, you know, refers to, and how it's a truth maker of propositions. You know, I'm just summarizing a lot in just about 2 minutes, just for our context here. But it's an incredibly important concept, nafs al-amr. Yeah, it's an incredibly important concept, and it does bring together this quote from Taj Kubrizada's book. But that's on wujud al-dhihni. But before he talks about wujud al-dhihni, he actually talks about nafs al-amr too, and he clarifies it in a very beautiful way what nafs al-amr refers to. And basically, he says those three things. So that's part, yeah. Allahu A'lam. That's a good question.
Assalamu alaikum.
Sam.
Yeah, so I have a question. So, what is exactly science by definition? So, do we call Isaac Newton a scientist today? Because he has so many metaphysical assumptions of his work and worldview. For example, Isaac Newton says that the world is a supernatural event, but our modern science says that you cannot rely on supernatural to explain anything, which is why Darwinism makes so much sense, because you eliminate the metaphysical perspective. You eliminated the divine. So by understanding the proper terminology of science, can we solve the metaphysical crisis that we are facing?
That's a great question. First, when I teach a metaphysical foundations course, and one of the first statements I put in my syllabus is that every science assumes a metaphysics. It's inescapable, right? You know, metaphysics is everywhere. You can't escape it. That includes, you know, it includes sciences like psychology, sociology, math, and it also includes the natural sciences, physics, chemistry, biology. They all assume a metaphysics prior to, and that metaphysics is logically prior to their particular science. And so that's something that I think we have to just, you know, I think we should be, we should make clear every time we talk about, you know, especially the scientists who say, oh, I don't, you know, like Stephen Hawkins, science has displaced philosophy, philosophy is dead, and things like this. It's like, no, philosophy is still alive. You have a philosophy that you subscribe to and that you're committed to. You have a metaphysics that you're committed to. You're just not recognizing it, you know. So we need to get scientists to recognize their own metaphysical commitments. That's very, very important. Every science assumes a metaphysics, period, you know. And that's how our ulama saw things. You can read Ghazali's in the Mustasfa's classification of sciences. You know, he changed the definition of ilm al-kalam. And he actually, it's very interesting. There's a shift, right? what Imam Ghazali did with al-Mustasfa is the subject matter of ilm al-kalam, he changed it to al-mawjud bima huwa mawjud. So Ghazali is saying here that kalam, theology, now studies the existent qua existent. And that's the definition of metaphysics, right? And so he basically, where kalam now is expanded into, and that's why you see during Imam Ghazali's time, but especially after him, he opened the door for a lot of metaphysical discussions in kalam itself. And you see that in our books, right? I mean, all this is metaphysics here, but these are discussions of post-classical scholars, and Ghazali is really mashallah that door, he opened that door for that. Of course, don't get me wrong, people disagreed with Imam Ghazali's identification of the subject matter as mawjud mahwujud, and e.g. Taftazani, they had their own discussions on it, but nonetheless, that's important to keep in mind. Now, so I wouldn't say that science does away with metaphysics. The science assumes a metaphysics, and that's why studying things like the philosophy of biology, the philosophy of physics, all of these things is incredibly important, and knowing the scientific method and what type of logic does it assume. Like many of the problems, unfortunately, this is the thing that when Muslims have talked about Islam and evolution, I don't know how it is here, but in the Western world, right, in the Anglosphere, when Muslims have talked about evolution and Islam, unfortunately, I felt that they haven't gotten to the real metaphysical problems, and that's where the tension lies. So for example, this definition of species, it's a very important issue, and we have to understand what's the current status and debate amongst philosophers of biology and evolutionary biologists on the definition of species, the definition of life. Can nature explain itself? Is the natural world self-explanatory? Right. So for example, you have some Muslims who are saying, well, we don't commit to an ontological naturalism. So science assumes a naturalism, right? And you have some Muslims who say, and that's contemporary science, right? Some Muslims will say, well, we don't assume an ontological naturalism, we'll assume a methodological naturalism. And they think, oh, we solved the problem here. No, you've created more problems, actually, that newer problems by this type of solution. And unfortunately, they haven't really philosophically thought about what does naturalism entail? What is a natural object? What do you need to explain and account for in a natural object? And if you say, and so can a natural object explain itself? Is it self-explanatory? In terms of can it account for what it is and how it is and how it came to be? And the answer is no. Right. So Isaac Newton's observation we would agree with, right? In many ways, it's unfortunate contemporary scientists won't agree with that, right? And so I think as Muslims, we need to go along the path that you're describing, which is to look at the metaphysical commitments of contemporary science and then replace it with our metaphysics and then conduct science the way our scientists conducted, their inquiries into the natural world, And it's really nice. You can see this in, for example, Ibn Nafis in his book Al-Mujas, right, which is a book of medicine. Before he starts his investigations, he starts speaking about the soul. He's speaking about the faculties of the soul, something that no biologist would ever, no medical doctor would even speak about in a medical textbook, because the soul has an explanatory role in natural phenomena in the human body. All right. You look at, there's a nice PhD dissertation done by studying Sayyid Sharif Jorjani's, he has a text in astronomy. And it's a really nice text in astronomy, and he's studying how his metaphysics and Ash'ari metaphysics informs his study of astronomy, right? And it's a really good dissertation done. I was just reading it. And so I think that's what we need to do. This is a lot of where the work is, And so we don't have an evolutionary psychology, we have our own psychology, where we don't have to, and then we can see, not everything in evolution is incorrect. A lot of their specific observations, you can't deny empirical observations, but at the same time, how do we explain them? And what can we infer from them? And what can we not infer from these observations? That's the question. That's over here that we need to, that's where metaphysics also enters. Okay. I don't know if I answered your question, but Allah Alam is.
I'm from KUE. I'm talking about effective, and what was your opinion about is meaning recognized? Talking about effective domain and cognitive domains. What is your opinion about is meaning cognized?
Could you repeat that? Or
Is meaning cognized?
Yeah.
oh, cognition. Oh, I'm not sure I can answer that question. I'm not a psychologist, so you know, you have to ask a psychologist that question. Is meaning cognized? Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, it's out of my specialty.
No,
Sorry.
he wants to ask
Yeah.
the difference between this cognitive and affective. Well, of course, psychology. This is psychology.
Yeah.
But is that your question? Yeah.
It can be like where integration is integration. Talking about giving a thought, giving some kind of integration between meaning and the cognitive, the thinking aspect, and the affective aspect.
Yeah.
The heart.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. That's something I haven't looked into, unfortunately. Yeah. Yeah. Allah Alam, I'm not, yeah. Maybe somebody else is here is able to answer that question. Yeah.
Yes, can I ask a question? Another good question from your friend.
My friend.
Yes, there is a question from Zoom, if I can read it. Jazakumullah khairan, Dr. Umar. Hamza Hashmi here.
Oh, mashallah.
Yes.
Okay. He's a good friend.
Just a quick question on Tashkubrizada's account of abstraction. In terms of the soul's preparedness to receive the universal from God's knowledge through the phantasm produced in the imagination after interaction with extra-mental particulars, is this requirement a customary RD or metaphysical, akli necessity? Yeah. Another question I had was, when it comes to the process of abstraction, is there a difference in abstracting natural universals versus logical or rational universals?
Wow. That's a lot of questions there.
A long answer.
MashaAllah. Walaikum assalam wa Hamza. I think you should be able to answer these questions. Hopefully, he's done a lot, mashallah. So regarding the first question, is this adi or akli? Right? It seems to be the case that this is adi, in the sense that this is how Allah Ta'ala has set up this world and created the world in this case, in such a way that this is how human beings come to know. Right? Although there is a discussion, and I would refer you to Dr. Najah Nadi, who used to be at CMC, and she wrote a nice essay on the relationship between premises in a syllogism and the conclusion. Is this adi or is it akli, a type of luzum akli? So the natija, when we form a conclusion, is this, what is the relationship between the premises and the conclusion that the human being arrives at? So in books of usul, interestingly, like Jamal Jawam and others, this is discussed in great detail, and books in usul al-fiqh. And according to her research, Imam Tabtazani, who she's a specialist in, she did hold that he held that the luzum between the premises and the conclusion is luzum akli, actually. Whereas other ulama of the Ash'ari school held this luzum adi, actually, So same case here, it would seem that this is adi in the sense Allah Ta'ala has set up the world in this way and to work in this particular fashion. Now the second question is, does this refer to the kulli tabi'i or akli or mantiqi? Right now, this process that Tashkubrizada is describing is referring to the kulli tabi'i, the natural universal, and how that is abstracted. right? And so what results at the end of the process of abstraction is that particular essence. But the kulli tabi'i, the question is, once that essence is abstracted, it's called a kulli tabi'i because that's the question is, does it exist extramentally? And the answer would be, according to many of the Ash'ari theologians, yes. And so what Tashkirvizad is describing is a stage in the process of abstraction, which results in the mahi of the essence. And then its universality takes the question of its universality and whether it's a natural universal or not, that's subsequent to the formation of the universal. So it seems like what Tashkirvizad is describing here is not that subsequent process, it's just the initial stage and the initial formation of the mahi or the essence. Wallahu a'lam, yeah.
Is it okay?
Yeah, alhamdulillah.
Yeah, alhamdulillah. Any other questions? I just like to let the professor know that we have in Zoom around 54 individuals who are tuning in Zoom, and we have here around 30 individuals here. Yes. Yes, so it's quite popular.
Alhamdulillah. Allah yabarak fikum. Dr. Bakr's presence.
Yeah.
Barakah, mashallah.
Speaking specifically about kalam is very, very important, very, very popular.
Oh, okay.
It's quite interesting because most of the time when people think of research, it's always applied research. No one wants to ask fundamental questions, like how to approach a particular understanding of the world, this reality, etc. So this is why I think the discussion here is quite useful. And we thank you very much for, if there's no more questions, we thank you very much for giving us such a good lecture. And apart from the specific questions on kalam, which we heard, you have a good question? You always have questions, brother. Yes. Are we allowing that, bro? Yes? Okay, go ahead.
One general question.
Yes.
How did Fakhruddin al-Razi come out with his Umur al-Amma? Because obviously he took some concepts from his readings on Ibn Sina, but his formulation, his reworking of the rearrangement of the subject matters is quite different.
Yeah, that is. I mean, I was going to say that too. We could spend about a good 45 minutes, and because there's a lot of history. But if I can give you a reference where they talks about. So in the Ash'ari school, the Kalam works post Fakhruddin Razi, they took on a different arrangement. So how do they arrange their books and their topics of inquiry? It did take on a different arrangement. And this was, Imam Fakhruddin Razi radiallahu anhu was key in that particular, in setting that new arrangement of topics and their investigation. So what you see in Sharh al-Maqasid, in the Maqasid, what you see in Mawaqif of al-Iji, what you see in Tawad al-Anwar, all these works, why do they have Umur al-Amma and Nadar and these type of arrangements, which didn't really exist in prior? And it's a bit unique in the sense that there's no Abyssinian precedent or other precedents for that as well. So if you look in the book of Al-Muhassal, of Imam Fakhruddin Razi, I think it's Muhassal, I'm going off my memory now. No, not Nihayat al-Uqul, but it just got published actually, or Al-Mufassal, sorry, fil Mantiq wal, I forgot the exact title. I'll remember inshallah. But there's a nice edition of it in 3 volumes. This work, Al-Mufassal, is the key work which presents a new way, a new ordering of the Masail, and a new categorization of the topics of inquiry into Kalam and metaphysics and Kalam. And it formed the basis for all the later, post-classical Ash'ari works too. So, and it's the editor of the work did a really good job in the introduction, historically identifying and giving an account of that change and comparing it to what Fakhruddin Razi has done to what Abyssinian has done in prior work. So I would recommend that to look into that, read that introduction. He did a good job on that, I would say. Yeah. So that's a short answer to the question, inshallah.
Thank you very much, Professor Umar, for enlightening us and for taking us through the whole spectrum of Muslim thought. especially specifying mainly on Kalam, Ash'ari Kalam. And we are eternally grateful to you for your sharing with us today. And it shows that perhaps there is, a time for us to go back and read and ask fundamental questions. There is that time now for us to go back and, alhamdulillah, we can do this in Istac, which is, with the leadership of Prof. Abdul Aziz, that we can have classes on Kalam, have classes on, for future students who really would like to ask and know about these questions which have implications on science, on knowledge, on, psychology, on everything, which, should be part of our daily discourse and our feast here in Istac, the feast of knowledge that we have here in Istac. This should all be satiated with the deep study of those books that were left behind by our predecessors before us. Thank you very much, Professor. I will pass now the program to our Dean.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Once again, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Very, very great thank to Prof. Omar for this great lecture today. We can name this week in Istac the week of philosophy and Kalam. Our professor, I'm not sure whether Prof. Muad Edward is with us. Yeah, he is here. Yeah, just yesterday, he presented a very deep kind of a lecture, and today also I really would like to thank Prof. Omar for all this in-depth analysis and his vast understanding and exposure on these very serious issues. Brothers and sisters, I can conclude that we are in fact lost. Okay, lost where? In the current and also sometimes past models and paradigms. And I think what Prof. Omar has put when he put in the title Sunni Metaphysics is really something good and tells a lot about what's happening in the Islamic world, and for that matter, maybe in the world. Maybe I can propose our next topic should be not Sunni metaphysics, but Quranic metaphysics, so that we discover the epistemological, ontological methodology of the Quran in addressing the issues, the problems, whether of the universal, the particular, or the specific, or the general, as Imam Shatibi did in his Muwafaqat. One of the great Muslim minds that dealt with these issues is Imam Shatibi. In his Muwafaqat, fi Usul al-Sharia, that man is trying to move the Muslim mind from the al-am wal-khas ila al-kulli wal-juz'i in the Sharia. And he's a master of Sharia. Imam al-Ghazali himself, in his the degrees of wujud, maratib al-wujud, the 5 degrees, we can understand how the Muslim mind tried to attempt these things. But today we are lost. Why? Because the Western model is dominating everywhere. And in fact, even when we do this, we are just reacting actually. We are not creating a model, we're just reacting. And as you know, let's say, for example, when Muslim scholars, Al-Ghazali, Al-Juwayni before, even Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, all these people, they dealt with a situation, with a context, with a reality. And if in fact you study the Imam al-Ghazali thought in his own context, many of our ideas about him will be wrong. If the same with Ibn Rushd, but they have done great job during their time, and the Muslim mind showed that it's really a mind that can think and create models and abstraction. But unfortunately, we don't have the ability and the models to study them in their context and then bring whatever relevant to us, relevantization to us today. That's why we are lost. Now, what I wanted to add to what Prof. Omar mentioned really greatly is that we need to aim for an Quranic Islamic paradigm of dealing with these issues. And that's what he said in his last sentence when he said, we need to develop our own metaphysics. Then we can understand the others' metaphysics and we can judge it because we have mi'yar, we have mizan, we have miqyas, we have criteria. Now, to me, the issue starts here, starts where we now here, for example, as Muslim, we know that what is existence? We know that there is alamul ghayb and there is alamul shahada. And in one first epistemological, ontological principle in Islam is this linkage between alamul shahada and alamul ghayb. One of the main principles of the Western epistemology today, and even from Aristotle onward, it's the physical world, it's the alamul shahada. And when you talk about metaphysics, you are talking using your aqal, your reason. And that's why Al-Ghazali was very angry. And he put maqasid and he put tahawut to tahawut. So brothers and sisters, we need to understand, to go to the Quran and understand the fundamentals of human existence, God's existence, the principles of the principles. One principle there is actually this idea of that alam al-wujud, alam al-ghayb, and alam al-shahada, and the degrees in this awalim, and how God created the human mind to understand this. So the question of our professor from engineering, when he wants to find the integration between the soul, the mind, the heart, the body, the senses, and the fitra, is actually principle number one in our epistemology. Can we create this? Can we find that this link here epistemologically? And the Quran provides a lot of insights for us to understand the relation between the soul, the mind, the heart. You know, in the whole Western world today, it's all body and mind. And now people who are trying in neuroscience and neurology and all this, they're trying to add that component of the soul, but you cannot define the soul because your epistemology is whether postmodern, from Heidegger, Habermas, Derrida, Foucault, before this, play all. You don't have the direction, but you have the power of the mind. That's why they are using the power of the mind. So the second principle in what we are talking about is how to bridge the revealed knowledge with this knowledge which we get here. For example, as Prof. Osman mentioned, for me, when I look at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, we have created you. Sorry, no. Sanurihim ayatina. We will show them our sign in the horizon and in themselves. So here, another principle in the metaphysics of it, in the epistemology of Islam. And that epistemology will help us to understand metaphysics and understand other things. So there is a lot of work need to be done at this level of the principles so that we guide our epistemology, we guide our metaphysical thinking. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about sunnah, the first question Ghazali put, who created man? Who created this aql? Who is talking and trying and going against wahy? Who created it? It's God. Who created universe is God. Who created your soul is God. Who created nature is God. Who created akhirah is God. That's another principle in our epistemology. It's all one network of meanings, but we are lost in these explanations, and this because we lose that bigger picture. So I think with what Prof. Omar mentioned today, I think our student of Istac, professors, scholars, new interest, new ideas. These are the issues we need. That's the job of Istac, to come up with the models, the paradigms, to guide revealed knowledge and human sciences, to guide sciences, to guide others. We're supposed to be Al-Ghazali here, Al-Nizamiya. You see, so brothers and sisters, I'm very happy today and yesterday with Prof. Muad and our Prof. And next Friday, I'm going to get for you another professor so that who will blow our minds again. Let me see who is our friend here. I think he's with you in Guantanamo.
Dr. Awesome.
Prof, I mentioned to you his name. I forgot the Asim, Professor Asim. We will try, inshallah. Okay, I am already in communication with them. Hopefully, inshallah, we can get him to give a talk also about how revelation related to science, bioscience and all this type of thing. Brothers and sisters, with this one, we would like from the bottom of our heart to thank our professor for all this great knowledge. I thank you all people who are here. You are really committed. Our people in the Zoom, everywhere in the world, always committed with the works, the things that we do in Istac, in the YouTube also. May God bless you all today and reward you. Before we end, we would like just to give a token of appreciation to our professor. Very humble, but just to say that we really thank you for your lecture today. This is also some of the application of the institute. They will give you later. No problem. Okay. Come, let's have a photo together like yesterday. Come. See here. Come.